She thought she had the perfect plan, a dead husband, a multimillion-dollar fortune, and a brand new life dripping in luxury. But what happens when greed meets deception? When every calculated move leads not to wealth, but to ruin? How far would someone go for wealth? How many lies would they tell, how many risks would they take, before everything crashes down? Before we dive into this shocking case, make sure to like this video and subscribe to this channel where we bring you the most twisted tales of greed, betrayal, and murder. Now, let's get into it. Jahlaya Nixon had always wanted more. More money, more status, more power. Born and raised in a working-class neighborhood, she spent her childhood watching other people live the kind of life she believed she deserved. The girls who came to school in designer clothes, the families who vacationed in places she'd only seen on TV, the ones who never had to think twice about money, she envied them all. And she swore she wouldn't spend her life struggling like her parents did, working themselves to the bone just to barely make ends meet. At 21, she thought she found her way out. Jahlaya Nixon, Del, as everyone called him, was everything she thought she needed. He was older, established, and most importantly, financially stable, at least that's what she thought. At 53 years old, he was already an overweight, diabetic, and set in his ways. He had already retired from his contracting business, a career that had been profitable enough to afford him a modest but comfortable life. He wasn't rich, not by a long shot, but he had a steady pension, a paid-off home, and enough savings to keep them comfortable. To a woman like Jahlaya, who grew up watching her parents scrape by, that had seemed like enough, at least at first. But marriage to Del wasn't the glamorous life she had imagined. While she had been picturing weekend getaways, shopping sprees, and a life of leisure, reality set in quickly. Del was content with what he had. He wasn't interested in extravagant vacations or flashy cars. He liked routine, simple pleasures, a home-cooked meal, a football game on TV, a quiet night on the porch. He had his habits, his ways of doing things, and he never saw a reason to change. His idea of a good evening was sitting in his recliner with a beer, watching reruns of his favorite old shows. For Jahlaya, it felt like a prison. At first, she tried to convince herself that love was enough. Del was a good man, loyal and dependable. He adored her, showered her with affection, and made her feel like the center of his world. But love, she realized, didn't pay for the things she wanted. And no matter how much he cared for her, he would never be able to give her the life she truly desired. She started resenting the way he settled into his routine, the way he seemed perfectly fine with their simple, predictable life. She hated the quiet nights, the small house, the boring conversations. To everyone else, they seemed like a normal couple. Del doted on his much younger wife, and Jahlaya played the role of the devoted spouse. But behind closed doors, she was restless, frustrated, and desperate for something more. She found herself fantasizing about a different life, a life filled with luxury, excitement, and freedom. And with each passing year, the resentment grew stronger. She didn't just want out. She wanted to walk away with everything. Del was worth more to her dead than alive. And all she needed was the right opportunity. The call came on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, a number she didn't recognize flashing across Jahlaya Nixon's phone screen. Normally, she would have ignored it. She had no patience for spam calls or bill collectors, but something told her to answer. The voice on the other end was smooth, professional, carrying the kind of authority that immediately grabbed her attention. "This is Nixon. I'm calling with important news regarding your husband, Mardel." Her grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" "My name is Kwame Mensah. I'm an attorney handling the estate of your husband's late great-uncle, Kofi Nixon. He recently passed away in Ghana, leaving behind a substantial inheritance." Jahlaya's heart skipped a beat. Inheritance? She barely heard the next few words as Kwame explained that Kofi Nixon had amassed a fortune, $30 million, to be exact. And because Mardel was one of his only living relatives, the money was his to claim. But there was a catch. "The funds are currently tied up in legal formalities," Kwame continued. "Certain documents need to be signed, and for that, Mr. Nixon must be alive. Once everything is processed, the money will be released. Jahlaya almost laughed out loud. This was it. This was her chance. The life she had dreamed of was finally within reach. No more struggling, no more resentment, no more being stuck with Dell in that dull, suffocating existence. $30 million meant freedom. It meant luxury, travel, designer clothes, expensive cars, everything she had ever wanted. But first, she had to get Dell on board. That night, she brought it up casually over dinner. Dell was halfway through a plate of smothered pork chops, barely paying attention when she said, "I got a call today about some money." "A lot of money," he grunted, chewing slowly. "What kind of money?" "An inheritance. From your great-uncle in Ghana." Dell scoffed. "I don't got no damn great-uncle in Ghana." "You do," she insisted. "Kofi Nixon. He left you $30 million. Dell chuckled, shaking his head. "That's a scam, baby. Ain't nobody leaving me no $30 million. It's real," she snapped, irritation creeping into her voice. "A lawyer called me?" Dell wiped his mouth with a napkin, leaning back in his chair. "Listen, Jahlaya, I know you want to believe it, but people run scams like this all the time. They tell you there's money, make you pay a bunch of fees, and next thing you know, you're broke." Jahlaya clenched her fists beneath the table. He wasn't taking it seriously. He was dismissing it, dismissing her. She spent the next few days trying to convince him. She showed him websites, read him fake legal documents, even had Kwame call again, but Dell refused to budge. He laughed it off, patted her on the shoulder, and went back to his routine like nothing had happened. But for Jahlaya, everything had changed. At first, she was just frustrated. Then, frustration turned into anger. Why did he always have to be so damn stubborn? Why couldn't he see what was right in front of him? If he wasn't going to claim the money, then what was the point of keeping him around at all? The thought hit her like a lightning bolt. What if he wasn't around? The money was tied to Dell being alive. That's what the lawyer had said. But what if there was another way? What if she could get around that little detail? For the first time, she let the idea settle in her mind. She could kill him. It wouldn't be immediate, of course. It had to be done right. No messy crime scenes, no obvious foul play. Something clean. Something quiet. Something no one would suspect. Jahlaya spent the next week researching different murder methods. Guns were too loud, knives too risky, and hiring someone was out of the question, too many loose ends. Poison, though, that had potential. She read about arsenic, cyanide, and even common household toxins. But then she came across something that made her pause: fentanyl. A tiny amount could kill instantly. It was practically undetectable if used correctly, and with Dell's health issues, his diabetes, his weight, his death would seem completely natural. No one would question it. That night, as Dell snored beside her, completely unaware of the danger sleeping just inches away, Jahlaya made her decision. She would kill her husband. And soon, she would be very rich. Jahlaya Nixon had never killed before, but as she sat in her car in a dimly lit parking lot, waiting for the dealer to arrive, she felt eerily calm. She had done her research, planned every step carefully. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about control. She was tired of feeling trapped, of waiting for life to hand her something better. If she wanted the good life, she had to take it. A black SUV pulled up beside her. The man in the driver's seat barely looked at her as he passed her a small, tightly wrapped package. "That's the good stuff," he muttered. "Strong as hell. Don't play around with it." She nodded, slipping him the cash before tucking the fentanyl into her purse. Back at home, Dell was right where she left him, sprawled in his recliner, TV blaring, completely unaware that his wife had just purchased his death sentence. He barely looked up as she walked past him and into the kitchen, setting the package on the counter with steady hands. Tonight, it would all be over. She cooked his favorite meal: smothered pork chops, collard greens, and cornbread, just the way he liked it. As the food sizzled on the stove, she carefully measured out the fentanyl, mixing it into the gravy until it dissolved completely. It was too easy. When she placed the plate in front of him, Del grinned. "Now this is what I'm talking about," he said, digging in. Jahlaya sat across from him, pretending to eat while she watched him take bite after bite. It didn't take long. At first, he just seemed tired, like the long day had caught up with him all at once. His eyelids drooped, his fork clattered onto the plate. He groaned, rubbing his temples. "Damn, I don't feel too good." Jahlaya tilted her head. "You okay, baby?" Del tried to stand, but his legs buckled. He caught himself on the table, breathing heavily, his face slick with sweat. His words slurred. "Something ain't right." Jahlaya stayed seated, watching as his body betrayed him. His limbs turned to lead, his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Panic flickered in his eyes, but he was too weak to fight it. It was time. She stood and moved behind him, wrapping her arms under his shoulders. "Come on, let's get you in the bath," she said gently. "It'll make you feel better." He barely had the strength to nod. Dragging his heavy body to the bathroom took every ounce of her strength, but adrenaline pushed her forward. She propped him against the sink, turning on the water and twisting the knob as far as it would go. Steam filled the room instantly. Del groaned again, barely conscious. She guided him to the edge of the tub. "Just sit right here," she whispered. The moment he was close enough, she shoved him forward. His face hit the water with a dull splash, his body twitching violently as he realized what was happening. His arms flailed weakly, but he had no strength left. The fentanyl had done its job. Jahlaya pressed down on the back of his head, forcing him under as the scalding water burned his skin. His body convulsed, but the fight drained out of him quickly. His muffled screams faded into silence. And then, nothing. She stood there for a moment, staring at the water as Del's body lay motionless beneath the surface. Steam curled around her, making it hard to breathe, but she didn't move. It was done. She took a deep breath, smoothing her hair before walking back into the living room. The next part was just as important as the first. She grabbed her phone, pressed it to her ear, and let out the most gut-wrenching scream she could muster. "Oh my God! My husband! He's in the tub. He's not breathing." The 911 operator's voice was calm, asking for details, but Jahlaya sobbed hysterically, pretending to be too panicked to answer properly. By the time the paramedics arrived, she was on the bathroom floor, clutching her chest as if her heart might give out. They found Del exactly how she planned, lifeless in the tub, skin reddened from the hot water, no signs of foul play. One of the EMTs gently pulled her to her feet, guiding her out of the room as the others worked. "Ma'am, we're so sorry for your loss." Jahlaya let herself collapse into the medic's arms, shaking, crying, playing the role of the devastated widow. Everything had gone perfectly. Or so she thought. Jahlaya Nixon stood at the front of the church, dressed in all black, a lace veil covering her tear-streaked face. Her sobs echoed through the chapel as Mardel's casket sat before her, surrounded by flowers and framed photographs. Mourners whispered about how deeply she must have loved her husband, how utterly broken she looked. Every tissue she dabbed at her eyes, every waver in her voice, every shuddering breath, it was all deliberate. She was putting on the best performance of her life. When it was her turn to speak, she clutched the podium, her body trembling. "Del was my everything," she choked out, pausing to let the emotion settle in the room. "I don't know how I'm supposed to go on without him." More sniffles from the crowd. Heads nodded in sympathy. She continued, weaving the perfect tale of grief and devotion. How he was the love of her life. How she had no idea what she would do without him. How cruel and sudden his passing was. But behind the veil, behind the crocodile tears, Jahlaya was barely containing her excitement. This was just a formality, a performance she had to endure before her real life began. The money would come soon, she could already feel it. She had done everything right. Once the funeral was over, she wasted no time slipping back into reality, her new reality. She spent the first few days after Del's burial lounging on the couch, her phone never leaving her hand, waiting for the call that would change everything. She ignored messages from distant relatives offering condolences, swiping them away as if they were nothing more than annoying notifications. The only number she cared about was Kwame Mensah's. Every time her phone rang, her pulse jumped. But it was never him. Days passed. Then a week. The excitement began to wane, replaced with impatience. She refreshed her email inbox over and over, scrolling through spam and junk mail, searching for any sign that her millions were on the way. Her mind drifted to all the ways she'd spend it. A luxury penthouse in downtown Atlanta. Walk-in closets filled with Chanel, Gucci, and Versace. A diamond-studded Rolex. A jet-black Range Rover with red leather seats. Lavish vacations to Dubai, sipping champagne on yachts, dripping in designer. She had already mapped out her new life down to the last detail. And then, finally, it came. An email from Kwame Mensah. The subject line read, "Urgent, final step for inheritance release." Her heart pounded as she clicked it open, a grin already forming on her lips. But as she read the message, the excitement drained from her body. Dear Mrs. Nixon, we are pleased to inform you that the processing of your late husband's inheritance is in its final stages. However, before we can release the $30 million to your account, there is one final legal requirement. A mandatory processing fee of $50,000 must be paid to the Ghanaian High Court to finalize the paperwork. Jahlaya blinked. Read it again. $50,000? Her stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. She scrolled further. There was a link for a wire transfer. A personal account number, not a business one. No official letterhead. No legal attachments. Her fingers trembled as she typed Ghana inheritance scam into Google. The results hit her like a slap. Inheritance scams prey on unsuspecting victims by promising large sums of money in exchange for advance fees. There is no actual inheritance, and once the victim pays, the scammers disappear. No. No, no, no. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. She grabbed her phone, searching through old calls and emails, scanning for anything real, something that could prove this was not what it looked like. But deep down, she already knew. There was no inheritance. No great-uncle. No money. She had killed her husband, for nothing. Jahlaya sat at the kitchen table, phone in one hand, a glass of wine in the other. The email was still open on the screen, mocking her. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had murdered her husband for nothing. She tried to think of a way out, a way to fix this, but there was none. The money didn't exist. Dell was dead. And now, she just had to move forward like everything was fine. But things were not fine. The first crack in her plan came when the insurance company refused to pay out. She had filed the claim almost immediately after Dell's funeral, expecting a smooth payout. Instead, she received a letter stating that the claim was under review. Then, a phone call. Mrs. Nixon, we have some concerns regarding your husband's cause of death. Jahlaya clenched her jaw. What kind of concerns? Well, the representative continued, his injuries don't exactly match an accidental drowning. The burns on his skin suggest prolonged exposure to scalding water, and the medical examiner found something unusual in his toxicology report. Jahlaya forced herself to sound confused. Unusual? What do you mean? There was a pause. The levels of fentanyl in his system were fatal. We're required to report this to law enforcement for further investigation. Jahlaya barely got through the rest of the call before her hands started shaking. They knew. Not everything, not yet, but enough to start digging. The police came knocking the next day. 2 detectives, a white guy with a buzz cut and a black woman with sharp eyes, sat across from her at the dining table, notebooks open, voices calm but firm. We're just trying to get a clear picture of what happened the night your husband died, the female detective said, watching Jahlaya closely. Can you walk us through it again? Jahlaya nodded quickly, keeping her expression composed. Of course. Dell wasn't feeling well, so I suggested a bath to help him relax. When I went to check on him, he was under the water. She sniffled, dabbing at her eyes. I called 911 right away. Buzzcut detective scribbled something down. And you didn't notice anything strange before that? No, she lied. He just seemed really tired. The black detective tilted her head. And you don't know how fentanyl got into his system? Jahlaya widened her eyes. Fentanyl? No, absolutely not. Del didn't do drugs. He barely even took his diabetes meds half the time. The detectives exchanged a glance. We'll be in touch, Buzzcut said, closing his notebook. Jahlaya barely kept it together long enough to shut the door behind them. The walls were closing in. Over the next few weeks, things only got worse. The police got a warrant for her search history. It didn't take long for them to find everything: the incriminating searches, the articles she had clicked on, the how-to guides she thought she had deleted. Her phone records betrayed her too. They traced her call history and texts, leading them straight to the dealer who sold her the fentanyl. Surveillance footage placed her at a gas station, handing cash to a known drug dealer. The evidence was stacking up. 2 months after Del's death, it all came crashing down. Jahlaya was at her favorite nail salon, flipping through a magazine as the technician painted her nails a deep shade of red. She had just begun to relax when she heard the commotion. Heavy footsteps. Murmured voices. Then, Jahlaya Nixon? She turned her head, her breath catching in her throat. 2 officers stood at the entrance, hands resting on their belts. The entire salon went silent. Her mouth went dry. Yes? One of them pulled out a pair of handcuffs. You're under arrest for the murder of Jahlaya Nixon. Gasps rippled through the room. Jahlaya barely had time to process what was happening before they yanked her to her feet. The scent of acetone and fresh polish filled the air as her hands, still wet from the manicure, were pulled behind her back and cuffed. She had dreamed of luxury, of money, of escaping her old life. Now she was being. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as people packed the gallery, eager to witness the trial of the year. News outlets had dubbed it the Greed murder, plastering Jahlaya Nixon's face across television screens and headlines. A woman who killed her husband for a fortune that never existed. It was almost poetic, they said. Jahlaya sat at the defense table, her expression unreadable. Gone were the designer dreams, the carefully crafted image of a grieving widow. In their place was the cold reality of an orange jumpsuit, shackled wrists, and a future that hung in the hands of 12 strangers. The prosecution wasted no time dismantling whatever hope she had left. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the district attorney began, pacing the floor with measured intensity. This is not a case of desperation. This is not a case of a woman forced into an impossible situation. No, this is a case of greed, manipulation, and premeditated murder. He turned to the jury, his voice unwavering. Jahlaya Nixon did not love her husband. She did not cherish him. She did not grieve him. She executed him, in cold blood, for a payday that never existed. Then came the evidence. Her search history. How to kill someone with fentanyl. How long does it take to drown a person? Inheritance scams. Each phrase was projected onto a massive screen for the jury to see, each word tightening the noose around her. Then, the prosecution played the 911 call. The courtroom fell silent as her voice echoed through the speakers. Oh my God, my husband, he's not breathing. I think he drowned. The jury listened closely. It wasn't what she said that mattered, it was how she said it. The flatness of her voice. The pauses that felt calculated. The absence of real hysteria. You've all heard real 911 calls, the prosecutor said once the audio ended. You know what true panic sounds like. Did that sound like a woman who just lost the love of her life? Heads shook. Jahlaya clenched her fists under the table. Her attorney tried to fight back, but the defense was weak. They painted her as a victim, a woman manipulated by ruthless scammers, pushed to the edge by financial strain and bad decisions. She was desperate, her lawyer pleaded. She truly believed the inheritance was real. She thought she was securing a future that her husband refused to claim. The scammers pressured her, and in a moment of irrationality, she made a terrible mistake. The words fell flat. The jury wasn't buying it. The deliberation took only 3 hours. Jahlaya stood as the foreperson delivered the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. A sharp gasp came from the gallery. Someone whispered, "Good." Jahlaya remained still. No tears. No outburst. Just a hollow stare as the judge peered down at her. "Jahlaya Nixon," the judge began, voice heavy with finality, "you took the life of a man who loved you, all for a lie. Your actions were cruel, calculated, and driven by greed. This court has no doubt that you are a danger to society." A pause. "I hereby sentence you to 45 years to life in state prison." A murmur rippled through the crowd. It wasn't the absolute worst outcome, but it was close enough. Jahlaya's face remained expressionless as the bailiff moved behind her, securing the cuffs around her wrists. As she was led away, reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. The world was watching her downfall in real time. She once dreamed of wealth, of power, of a life draped in luxury. Now, she would spend the next 4 decades trapped behind bars, surrounded by nothing but the crushing weight of her own choices. She thought she was setting herself up for a life of luxury, but instead, she got a life sentence. The only money she inherited? The $35 left in Mardell's bank account. She thought she was securing a fortune, but all she got was a prison sentence. Was Jahlaya a victim of her own greed, or was she too blinded by the illusion of wealth to see the truth? If this story shocked you, like and subscribe for more cases that prove greed is never worth the price.